Should 50% of Hong Kong people be living in subsidised housing? Should that be the objective? There is no housing crisis in 2018. The Town Planning Board has gone back to the Planning Department and said, why aren't you using the land properly? And that's a fundamental starting point for anything. I've been here for 40 years, and I do a lot of work for developers, and I do also work for NGOs. But one of the things that's fascinating me is in this discussion that's taking place over the long-term housing supply and so on, is the facts are not necessarily as stated. And what happens, we have assumptions built on assumptions built on assumptions. And as a result of that, we don't actually know really what we're trying to do, what the problem is, and how to solve it. And the first point, when we're looking at it in a sustainable manner, and it's basically along the lines that Tom said, we should look at things we can do that aren't physical changes as the first priority. And so we affect our environment as the last resort. The objectives and the indicators in this process are very, very unclear, and I'll try to explain that. And one of the things that we found in the discussion and the documents produced by the long-term housing supply process is that they're not prepared to go back and question anything that has been assumed, such as in the 2030 study and before that. So they're not going back to look at other ways of doing things. The only answer is to find more land. So that's when we come to the fourth point, where if you don't just take land as being the solution to the problem, let's look at the other things, the bureaucratic controls, the policies and so on, which may also affect the system. Now the first point is that for about the last 4 years we've been making representations to the government saying, if you're going to have these new development areas, then you should optimize the development. And we've been pushing them to say, this is the top level of production you can get out of this piece of land, this is a medium term, and this is a lower level. And we should look at the implications of going for either of these levels in terms of the infrastructure that's required, in terms of the number of people you can accommodate, and the economic facilities. But what happened is that they've accepted one standard, and the planners will sit in a box somewhere and they'll decide this is a good plan, and then they'll put it out and they'll just say this is the only plan that we've tested. Anything different from that, we haven't done the studies on the infrastructure requirements, therefore this plan is a good plan. And as a result, they've adopted, in many cases, densities of development which are less than Shanghai Newtown, and that's less than the standards. And they don't actually look at the implications of adopting these lower standards, and at the end of a discussion in Hong Kong Q, which has only just been concluded, the Town Planning Board has gone back to the Planning Department and said, why aren't you using the land properly? And that's a fundamental starting point for anything. If we're going to put infrastructure and utilities and plan the development, we should optimize, because they keep telling us land is scarce, but they're not utilizing it in the correct manner. And so these are in the various new development areas. We've made proposals to change the plot ratio. And if you just look at the population things, this one is government's and that one's ours. You can see that we can progressively increase the production. And this is the extra number of flats that we get. And overall, we finish up with 60,000 flats just by minor adjustments to the plot ratios of the developments, bringing them up to the standard which the planning standards state. And 60,000 flats is 1 year's production. So that's just by doing minor things. There is no housing crisis in 2018. And this is a theme which I've tried to develop over the years. When I came here, this is why we came, because there was a housing crisis. And this is what we were dealing with. People were living in conditions which were totally unacceptable. They were unsafe. This was public housing at the back of squatter areas, and these have largely all gone. One of the other things was the risk of fire and landslips and so on. And they were put into the Mark 1 housing as a result of a real need to provide good housing. And part of my job when I arrived was to redevelop these into what you can see in the previous one. No, not that one, obviously. But this is public housing at Choi Hall, and that was the alternative to what was in the base, the Mark 1 estate. So that was a physical need, and it was also in terms of affordability. So those are the two criteria that are mainly used when we're actually looking at the need for housing. Now, the basic assumptions in the housing assessment is that 45% of all households in Hong Kong live in some form of subsidized housing. And that's a huge percentage. Very few cities in the world can state that they have that emergency situation. Now, 45% of the households are living, by definition, by government, in adequate housing in terms of the content of the housing, and they're subsidized so that it's affordable. And a lot of public housing flats are rented for around about $2,000 a month. When we look at the top portion, the wealthy, there's about 25% of the population are wealthy enough not to be worried about affordability and not to be worried about the adequacy of their housing. So the definition by government is only about 123,000 households living in housing which is inadequate, and that's squatter huts, it's subdivided flats, and it's sharing flats. So if you're sharing flats, it's considered to be inadequate. So what I think should be happening is that those 123,000 should be getting the priority. And it's not a huge percentage. That's 3 years of public housing production. So the system that they've got gives no priority to these 123,000, to the people who are living in poor housing. And we always hear about the partition flats. That's a physical problem, not a social problem. All of those flats are probably being renovated illegally. They don't have adequate requirements. The buildings department could take action to rectify those situations, and they could move those people, 123, they could move them into good public housing, and then they must demolish the flats. Demolish the partitions within the flats, return them to original form, or it will just be perpetuated, not because of the people, but because of the physical nature. There's no definition of affordability in the way that government looks at the need for public housing. And the question is, should we be paying tax dollars to pay for affordable flats? And the big cost of providing public housing and providing infrastructure to go with it, if you took that in a different form and used it to subsidize people's affordability, then you could look after a lot more people. Now, I'll just give you some indicators here. These are from the Council of Social Services, which there's a whole lot of it. If you go to their website, they have all these indicators of social factors which are relevant. And if you look at this is 1986 going through to now, and you can see this is the trend that's happened. The quality of the housing and the accommodation has improved. Here we have the number of households living in temporary housing. It's gone down to virtually nothing now. Number of persons in caged housing, this is not surveyed very regularly. And we finish up with, this is 81. There's a big jump there, but then it comes down again. But these are the people living in caged accommodation. So So homeless persons per 100,000, and you can see that generally it's a trend going down. It has kicked up a bit in the last few years. This is 2011, 2016 on that side. So these, I think, help indicate that there's not a supreme problem in terms of housing accommodation. There's not a dire need in terms of what people actually require. And this is something which I could never understand until relatively recently. Why has there been, since 2006, this massive increase in the number of people on the public housing waiting list? And this is where we come back to, we should be looking at what the situation is that creates this. And what has created this is not a need for housing, but the way that they've structured the system for making it people eligible for the housing. Now, Housing Authority introduced this quota and point system. What happened is they changed the regulations in 2005 so that single persons 18 and above could apply for public housing. So if you look at what happened, a massive number of single people applied for housing, and a lot of them were young. So then they're given a priority to elderly people. The general applicants still get the overall priority, but 10% is now reserved for the elderly, for the non-elderly. 50% of the total applicants in the waiting list are singletons, single-family households. And the priority is based on a point system relating to age and to how long they've been on the waiting list. And some of the older people who are living in subsidised flats have been there for 7 years because they can't get any priority. They can't get enough priority because of the system. So, if we move on, this is an interesting graph. Before they changed the system to allow single households, everything was going pretty well. This is the general thing, the general group of people who are eligible for housing. And you can see that it's still, this is 2018, it's still being achieved within a 3-year period. Now, the difference, and this is where we get up to almost 50%. These are the singletons. These are the single-person households that are waiting. And the Council on Social Services recently, they released a study which said that the only real problem in Hong Kong at the moment in terms of the social, all the social indicators, is this massive increase in the waiting time, because now it's up to 5 point something years, right? But the waiting time is only determined by the number of singletons that are actually waiting for housing. Now the question is, should an 18-year-old be eligible to apply for public housing? Why can't they look at alternative ways of sharing flats? There's it's almost like getting on a lottery, right? And quite a few people know that if you're a student studying university, you put your name down on the waiting list because you know that in 7 years' time you might be in a position where you become eligible for it. So, the public rental housing income limits are structured by two parts. This one is the housing costs, and this is the non-housing costs. And this is the system that the government uses every year. And what happens is that every year the eligibility is increased, right? So the household income goes up. It's gone from 44 to 46, it's gone from 91 to 93, depending on the size of the household. And that naturally increases the number of people who become eligible. And so it went up from 135,000 households to 140. And it's got nothing to do with the actual need for housing. It's to do with affordability. And even if the non-housing costs increase, and not the housing costs, then it still is added together to make more people eligible for public housing. Sorry, we went the wrong way. So this figure that you see and everything that the government does makes it an unnecessarily large demand for housing. And we're talking about subsidising affordability. There is adequate housing because of those 400,000 people that are households that are in the lower 50%, only 123,000 are actually living in inadequate housing. Everyone else is living in an adequate flat. So, if their flat is eligible, why are we building new flats if it's already acceptable? So instead of building new flats, if you want to subsidise them in a social way, subsidise affordability, then why not provide a rent subsidy voucher, which has been done in the States, and the HUD has a system there where they can actually provide eligible vouchers. And if you provide the vouchers, you solve the affordability problem without having to build new flats. So there's about 30% of the people living in public and private housing at the moment are eligible for this, for public rental housing, but they don't actually need a new flat. All they need in terms of this is to subsidise their affordability. And also, if you look at the affordability of people for home ownership schemes, when the last one was put up, which had about 2,000 flats, it was oversubscribed by 49 times. Not because the people needed the accommodation, but because of the significant difference in terms of what it costs to live in public housing, what it costs to live in private housing. So you go in to the lottery, right? This is the percentage of income that people spend on accommodation, and it's from 30 to 35%, so it's slightly going up. And this is all households in Hong Kong, which includes the public housing households. And 35% is accepted as being a reasonable figure in other places, Canada, the States, Australia, as being the amount of money that people should pay for accommodation. And if we look at this one, the average monthly household expenses, a proportion of the total household income of the lowest 50% of those renting, right? The public housing, they're paying 1,100, which is about 11%. Here they were paying, in private housing, 5,342%. And it's gone up a bit, 13.2, 44.4. So there's a massive difference. This is the lottery from 1,500 to 7,600. That's the lottery. If you can get yourself into the public housing queue and get a public housing flat, that's the benefit. It's not necessarily one related to getting a more permanent accommodation. This is the cost from 1994 to 2018 of the residential secondary private property market. And you can see it's consistently going up. And nothing during that period can change. This is 1997, and then you'll see a couple of big drops in the market which relate to the financial crisis and the SARS. And the only thing that's caused a drop in the price of accommodation have been our external events. None of the controls the government's put into place has had any effect whatsoever. There's quite a lot of analysis of the relationship between the supply of flats and the market, and there's no correlation. So the idea that if you provide more flats in Hong Kong is going to result in a reduction in price, it's never been proven. It's just something which they keep saying, we must build more, we must build more, but you won't get a cheaper flat from it. Some of the things that obstruct affordability. Firstly, the monetary authority's restrictions, which only make it unaffordable for people who don't have enough money to pay the deposit. If you can't get the deposit, 60% or whatever it is that you have to pay, you'll not be able to pay. Then we have to pay the taxes that they've got in. Old buildings, you cannot really borrow on a building that's more than 30 years old. They have this restriction. Why is that in place? Because that's the sort of building and a flat that young can probably afford to get into. The deposit requirement alone, unless you can get it from your family, there's no particular way that you can get it. And the reality is that households in Hong Kong have to budget between 40 to 50% of their monthly income to be in accommodation. It's a high cost town to live in. So let's define affordability. All flats sell in Hong Kong over a weekend, so it's affordable to someone. So who is the problem that we really need to address, and that's never defined. The rental voucher, in a similar way to assessing people's requirement in terms of a public rental housing flat, that voucher system could solve the problem of affordability and the waiting list immediately. You don't have to wait to build flats, you don't have to do reclamation. You provide, if affordability is an issue, then you deal with it in a relatively cheap manner by issuing vouchers. Alternatively, you could say, if you wanted a policy, and they don't have a policy, should 50% of Hong Kong people be living in subsidised housing? Should that be the objective? At the moment, they're pushing it higher and higher. There'll be more flats taken out of the private market and used for public housing. There's a very false hope that everyone will be able to afford to buy a flat. So I think they should be upfront about it and say, we don't expect everyone to be able to afford a flat because you won't be able to. And then it's changed some of the regulations that we just talked about, the eligibility criteria. Let's look at the reality of what the waiting list is consisting of, and then you can start looking, after you've done all of that and you've improved the production from the actual new development areas, then you come back and you say, okay, now we have to do a reclamation, or now you have to get into the greenbelt areas. But at the moment, as far as I can see, there's nothing that justifies that. And no doubt you'll disagree with a lot of that, but I think someone has to say, what are we actually trying to do in terms of the stats and the figures that are in the market, that are in academia, that they're actually produced by the Census and Statistics Department, and they don't support the fact that we have a crisis and we have to do something extraordinary. Thank you.